Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Jonathan Mahler, the author of The Gods of New York, Egotists, Idealists, Opportunists, and the Birth of the Modern City, 1986 to 1990. This is his third book, and he is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine. Thanks so much for being here, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The best thing about 1986 in New York is that the Mets won the World Series. And in many ways, that team was indicative of what was happening around the city at that time. Brash young guys living large, succeeding, but also fighting on the big stage and fighting their own personal demons. Now, I don't want to take that baseball analogy too far, so I'll stop it there. But Jonathan argues that by 1990, New York was awash in those fights, in the dark side of all of that. There was drugs and homelessness and racial tension, the rise also of a conservative backlash that would shape the nation well into the 2020s. So, Jonathan, just given that you covered the late 70s with your Bronx is Burning book, when and how did you realize that it was actually the late 80s that were the key to understanding New York?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one way to think about this, the best way to think about this is as kind of the next chapter. So, to even go back a little bit further, and I won't belabor the point too much, but if you're thinking of the city's history in chapters, you think about New York in the kind of post-World War II era as like America's great working class city, right? It was a city that was kind of bustling with small manufacturing. The shorelines were filled with cargo ships, longshoremen kind of dragging massive boxes off of these ships and et cetera. Big, powerful labor unions, big working class city, right? So that's sort of New York after World War II. Then in the 60s and into the 70s, that all gets kind of hollowed out by deindustrialization, which of course is a kind of a national, international, global phenomenon. And all these factories move out of the city or close down. The shipping industry kind of dies, and New York is left with nothing. So my book, the ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is Burning, is kind of about New York bottoming out in the 70s, right? When there's kind of nothing, there's no economy in New York, there are no working class jobs, there's really nothing going on. Rich people are fleeing the city, the kind of famous era of white flight. 1 million people left the city in the 1970s. Then this book, The Gods of New York, is about what happens next. And what happens next is a whole new city, a shimmering new city of skyscrapers and luxury co-ops and condos gets built on top of the ashes of the New York of the 1970s. And this new city is driven by this new city's economy is not driven by manufacturing or shipping. It's driven by Wall Street, finance, and real estate. And that is kind of modern New York. That's the story of the birth of modern New York. And that's the story I tell in this story, the kind of convulsive and fraught and messy birth of this new city and the winners and the losers. I mean, that's sort of what this book is about.
Before I go any further, I do want to mention that axelbankhistory.com, which we just launched, was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. Definitely check her work out. It has our most recent episodes on it, featured episodes, and also a link to our Patreon page. So your book focuses on the 4 years of 1986, 1987, 1988, and 1989. Very specifically, actually, it literally starts New Year's Day of 1986. What were the determining factors and why you chose those 4 years, and also why you shaved it down to not start in 1985 or end in 1990? Very specifically, New Year's Day 1986 is when it starts.
Yeah, I had a few reasons. One was this was the last term of New York's kind of famous, iconic mayor Ed Koch. This was would be his third and final term. He would run for re-election for a fourth term, but would lose kind of at the end of the book. But so So Koch's last term is sort of the spine of the book in a way. He's kind of one of the sort of central figures, one of my gods of New York. And what you see during these 4 years is the kind of great rebirth of the city that Koch has presided over, which is kind of what I was referring to before, this kind of this new city that's built on the ashes of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. This shimmering new city that Koch has presided over the building of all kind of begins to unravel during these 4 years. So there was that reason, and the other reason was simply that these 4 years contained such a kind of crazy confluence of iconic events. I mean, I just almost, as an author, I just almost kind of couldn't believe that everything that happened in these 4 years actually happened in this compressed period of time. I mean, we're talking about a series of racial incidents that are still kind of infamous to this day, from Howard Beach to Tawana Brawley to the Central Park Five to the murder of Yusuf Hawkins. We're talking about the collapse of the biggest stock market crash in the history of Wall Street, the Black Monday in October of 1987. We are talking about the emergence and rise of crack cocaine. We're talking about the birth of the AIDS activist movement, ACT UP, which was probably one of the most influential activist groups ever created, and obviously in response to the AIDS crisis, which these years also cover. Last but not least, I'd mention the release of the movie Do the Right Thing. And Spike Lee again is kind of one of my other gods of New York, and I go into a lot of detail telling the story of the making of that movie, which was very much a direct response to everything that was going on in New York during those years.
The book's beginning is Wednesday, August 30th, 1989. It's the day of the funerals for Yusuf Hawkins, who you just mentioned. He's a black teen who'd been killed in Bensonhurst. You would have been about 20 at the time, not to be creepy, but I didn't look and
Yeah,
see
yeah.
about how
I
old
was
you
in,
would have.
I was in college for these 4 years. Yeah. So
And you were living in New York at the time or from New York
I
at the
was,
time?
my family was living in New York. I was going to college in Chicago, and I would read, there was a in the student center, there was a great kind of periodicals room back then,
Yeah.
all the print publications. And I would read the Village Voice every week. I would read Spy Magazine. I would read, all the sort of music magazines, and I was just kind of like watching what was happening in New York, keeping track of what was happening in New York from afar and coming home on vacations.
Yeah, gosh, that's how I did it in college too. And gosh, don't you miss those magazine rooms and the
It was the
newspaper
best.
rooms?
It was the
They
best.
were the best.
Yeah.
I was a Time
Yeah.
and Newsweek subscriber for like a decade.
Yeah.
Um, so you would have been about 20. The point of all that is you would have been about 20 at the time. And I'm just curious, what was it like for you to go back as you researched and wrote this book to study a time that had really probably been fully cooked in your mind over the last
Yeah.
30 years?
Yeah.
Did you find yourself taking down your preconceived notions of what you remembered from it?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, it was a little bit like uh, if you imagine, finding an old photograph or something of an old family photograph or something where you're kind of everyone in it looks a little bit familiar. You start out with everyone looking a little familiar, but you're like, who was that? Was that Aunt Jane or whatever? And then you start digging into the the history, and the picture kind of comes into a different kind of focus. That's sort of how this was. I mean, all these characters were somewhat familiar to me. Working at the Times over the years, I've obviously encountered some of these figures in my kind of day job. Um, and all these events kind of were vaguely familiar to me, but I really, didn't had no idea kind of I didn't know any of the details. I didn't really know any of the kind of the real sort of forces at work in New York, and I was just kind of constantly struck by I think I would also say I just did not have an appreciation for just how kind of crazy and intense and electric those years were in the city. I mean, I think, you may remember the novel Bonfire of Vanities,
I
which,
don't.
you may be a little too young to remember it. Okay.
I don't.
So in 1987, Tom Wolfe, you probably know him, the
Yeah.
sort of great American novelist Tom Wolfe wrote a book called The Bonfire of the Vanities, which was a huge bestseller, big phenomenon, and it was later turned into a movie starring Tom Hanks. And Bonfire of the Vanities was this was a novel about this period of time in New York, about the 80s. And in many ways, my book is kind of the nonfiction version of Bonfire of the Vanities. But this book, was really, I mean, it was a number one bestseller for weeks, and everyone across the country was reading this book. And I read it in college, and it also kind of sort of stuck with me. So part of this was also part of this project was also kind of, going back and kind of learning the sort of the true story, like what had inspired this kind of great American novelist to write this novel.
The interesting thing about the day you chose, the day of Yusuf Hawkins' funeral, is that all six of your main heroes converge on that day.
Yeah.
Dinkins, Sharpton, Spike Lee, Giuliani, Koch, Trump.
Yeah.
Did you look for a day that they all converged on, or you did you look at it the other way and say, well, these are the six people. How can I, piece together where they all were and decide that this is the big day? Or was the use of Hawkins the day you had pre-chosen as, yeah, this is the key entry point?
It was more the latter. I had I would say it was what had happened was that I was well on my way with the book when I had the notion. And the idea was essentially like I did want an opportunity in the prologue to just get all as many of my big characters on the stage at one moment as I could, just as kind of a matter of craft. But I also felt like there was something about this funeral where you had a black teenager who had gone into a white neighborhood in Bensonhurst with a couple of his friends to look at a used car. They'd been attacked. Yusuf Hawkins had they thought they were just going to get beat up. One of the kids who attacked them pulls out a gun and shoots Yusuf Hawkins, and it really just had come. It was the kind of last in a series of just kind of brutal racial incidents that had happened over the course of these years that I write about. And it really brought so much, it was like, it really felt like kind of the culmination of years of tension and, and kind of resentment and et cetera in the city. And so I felt like this was kind of where things in my book kind of built toward. It was this moment that everything was kind of building toward. And so I decided that I would kind of open the book with that funeral, this like incredibly kind of poignant, powerful funeral that all, as you say, all of the politicians, public and the rap group Public Enemy was there, Spike Lee was there, everyone was there at this funeral. It was a huge event. Um, I would open with the funeral, and then I would kind of tell the whole story of these 4 years and come back to Yusuf's murder at the end of the book. That it would just be kind of narratively, it kind of made sense because it's like this is where New York ended up, and then this is how New York got there.
In your view, were there specific things that the city did to resurrect itself after the 1970s, or is it just kind of this ebb and flow of how business works and how cycles go that things tend to recover sort of naturally after great difficulty?
Yeah, no, this was a deliberate decision that the city made, and basically, you could argue that the city really didn't have much of a choice. That the it could no it the tax base was gone, the manufacturing jobs were gone, the working class city was gone,
I mean, a
and so the
million
question
people left the city. That's an
million
unbelievable
people left the
number.
state. Crazy number, crazy number. And they needed something else to sort of fuel their economy. And so, there was a very deliberate decision that was made to kind of reorient the city's economy around Wall Street and around private industry. And so they did that by kind of maybe most notably by encouraging real estate developers and companies to stay in New York and to build new buildings in New York. And they did that by with tax incentives, with massive tax incentives, and with zoning waivers, allowing you to, New York has very strict zoning laws about how big buildings can be and about, all sorts of kind of rules. And they waived a lot of those rules. They gave companies and developers a lot of huge tax breaks to build. And then what happened is, kind of not surprisingly, developers started to scoop up cheap rental buildings and turn them into luxury buildings and office buildings where all these new investment these expanding investment firms, the big ones, and boutique investment firms, and that's sort of what that was the city that kind of came sprang to life. And it was a very deliberate decision that also dovetailed, I should say, with the Reagan presidency. And these were Reagan's idea that the free markets should drive America's economy. He was, obviously very anti-regulation. He cut taxes. So what New York was doing was also very consistent with where the nation was going during these years.
I'm really curious about how you piece this all together in terms of your sources. One of the best things about watching stuff from the late 70s and 80s is that broadcast TV is really in its heyday. Did you rely on newspapers, and did you go to YouTube and other broadcast archives and find local news stories?
I did, yeah. So I mean, this was a little of everything. It was this the research for this book was a hybrid. I mean, I did a ton of interviews. I did more than 200 interviews, and those were, with everyone who was still around from that era. But I also did a lot of archival newspaper work. I did a lot of archival, as you say, local TV news, because it was a big it was a big era for local news here in New York. And I also did a lot of kind of archival work in various, actual archives. So, for instance, Mayor Koch's papers. There's a great oral history of Ed Koch at Columbia University. Larry Kramer's papers which are in New Haven. I write quite a bit about the police commissioner of New York at the time, Benjamin Ward. He was the first black police commissioner in the city's history. He has an archive at John Jay College, which I discovered had an unpublished memoir that he'd written. So, that was all very useful as well.
How reliable did you find the memories of the people who you interviewed, 200, you said, when you compare it with what was in that public record?
Yeah, it varied, and one of the things that I've noticed, in because the research I did for The Bronx is Burning was somewhat similar. It was a similar hybrid, and what I noticed during that book, and I noticed again with this book, was, you the deeper into your research you get, the more the more immersed you are, and the more authoritative I became on these issues, the more my interviews would be, but by the end, I was almost correcting people, and then
Yeah, no, as you read and watched the media of the day, I mean, you and I are both in news media, so it's interesting to evaluate it as you watched the media and um, looked at what the sources today were saying, and also looking at the benefit of, with the benefit of hindsight. What grade would you give the media and how they covered all of these events?
yeah, well, that's a really good question. I mean, the I write quite a bit. I use the tabloid media quite a bit, and I do that very deliberately in this book, because when I'm talking about the tabloid media, I mean the New York Post, the Daily News, Newsday. These were huge daily tabloids that everyone in New York read at the time. And I do it very deliberately because, for that reason, because the tabloids were really the voice of the city, and the columnists at these tabloids, who were these kind of larger than life figures then, guys like Jimmy
Jimmy
Breslin, kind of rose.
Breslin, yeah.
And I use them a lot because they really kind of they were kind of driving the narrative in New York. And I feel like they did kind of two kind of somewhat contradictory or paradoxical things. In one moment, they were really polarizing forces, because that's what tabloids do, right? Tabloids divide the world up into heroes and villains. They're almost like comic books. So on the one hand, they were really polarizing the city, but on the other hand, because everyone was reading them, they were also kind of bringing the city together around the same storylines, and that is what kind of allowed all of these figures from Trump to, Sharpton to Spike Lee to become such larger than life figures because everyone was reading about their exploits in these same three newspapers. And that also created a sense of kind of a sort of civic responsibility and civic ownership. People like cared about the city because they were reading, everyone was reading about the same place all the time. It's not like today where the media is totally fragmented. Everyone's got their own kind of their own news feed and their own, they choose their own sources and they're focused on totally different things. Here, everyone was reading the same three tabloids plus the New York Times about, and these stories, these papers were covering the same stories. And so you all felt kind of invested in those stories. You felt invested in the life of New York in a kind of a different way than people do today, I think.
Gosh, don't you miss those papers?
I
I
sure do. Yeah.
I mean, they're still around and there are people working hard. I don't want to take away the hard work, but my dad used to come back with the daily news and I'd get it every night and read it. And, then you ended up getting, I remember when I went to high school, I'd get my own papers on the way to the train in
Yeah.
the morning. I
Yeah,
miss
you used
those
to get on
days.
the subway and it was just everyone reading
I
it down.
know.
Yeah.
Everyone
Yeah.
was reading the paper. What a peaceful, well, not, I don't know about peaceful, but what a great way to start your day. How much immersion
Yeah.
did you do? Did you find it at all necessary to walk the same streets that these events happened on? Did you find that to be a worthwhile thing to do, even
Yeah.
35 years since
Yeah.
these things happened?
Yeah, yeah, I did do that, and fortunately, I live in New York, so it was easy for me to just kind of take myself to these places geographically, and I worked on this book. I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I've been working on this book for 8 years, so I that was not my intention. I was expecting to get it done in a few years, but it was just there was I just I just kept feeling like there was another door to open, another alley to go down. And yeah, and yeah, because I was in New York, I was able to see all these places myself. Yeah.
How did you find magazine
And I was able
writing?
to sort of interview a fair number of these characters in person, which was nice too.
Yeah, yeah. How did you find magazine writing versus book writing? Do you have to turn on and off a certain switch?
Yeah, it's there's some clear similarities, like structuring. It's all in both cases. It's ultimately you're structuring a story, right? You're structuring a narrative. You wanna get some momentum. You want to get people invested in your characters. That's the same, but the scale is just so much bigger with a book. So I like to think of it as sort of, you reach a point, and I do this with every magazine story. You reach a point where you have the whole story, magazine story, kind of in your head. You know where all the pieces are. Oh, here's where I introduce this character. Here's where, oh, this will kind of, this moment will remind readers of something a seed that I kind of planted earlier in the story. With a book, it is so difficult to get to that place because you're talking about, many, many thousands of words. I mean, this book is 140,000 words. It's a 400 plus page book. To get to the point where the whole book is kind of in your head and and particularly because this book was, it was really important to me that this book like kind of read like gangbusters. I wanted it to just be like feel novelistic, feel like you just got swept up in the story. But at the same time, I had a pretty big cast of characters and different storylines that I wanted to deal with. So it was like as it was a real kind of narrative challenge to just make sure that everything was fitting together well and that the story was like that it didn't slow down at any point.
Did you do the Robert Caro thing of saying, I've got to have a side biography of all my main people before I really introduce the narrative part of it?
I did, but I do a real compressed version of it. And that's something that I'm doing for my years as a magazine writer because you always have to introduce your characters in magazine stories, but you don't want to take up too much space with that kind of biographical detail. What you want to do is give readers the salient information, what they need to know about a character to get invested in their stories. So that's what I do in my magazine stories, and that's what I did to a kind of on a larger scale, but still not a Caro-esque. scale in this book. I give you, when I introduce Al Sharpton, I tell you all about, oh, where did this guy come from? His parents came to New York in the Great Migration of blacks to the East, North and East. He this is where he grew up in Brooklyn. He was he didn't play stickball in the streets. He went to church. He was a church kid. He would practice preaching with his sister's dolls to his sister's dolls. He delivered his first sermon when he was 4 years old at his church, and he was known as the Wonder Boy preacher. I give you a kind of a capsule bio of these guys before I kind of launch them into their story.
So 1986, back to just our narrative a little bit here. 1986 begins with Koch getting re-inaugurated. He had every right to be confident. He had a sweeping electoral victory. What did he not see coming?
Well, he didn't he did not he knew he had a sense that the city had some problems that needed to be dealt with. So for instance, the AIDS epidemic had just kind of arrived, or had arrived a few years earlier and was getting worse. Um, the crack had just arrived in New York, had really just arrived months earlier. Um, there was homelessness really for the first time in the city's history. People were sleeping in the streets. He knew there were things that needed to be dealt with. There was racial tension kind of simmering beneath the surface. A young art student, Michael Stewart, had been arrested and then 45 minutes later was delivered in a coma to the hospital, to Bellevue Hospital, and had clearly been killed while in police custody. That had happened very recently, so the feelings from that were still very raw. So Koch kind of knew that the city had these problems. He did not fully appreciate how serious they were. He could not anticipate how bad the AIDS epidemic was going to get. He could not anticipate how bad the plague of crack was going to become, how big a problem that was going to become. He could not anticipate the crash on Wall Street, which was going to decimate the city's budget. And so, I think he knew he recognized that he had some problems to deal with, but he did not fully appreciate how serious those problems were.
Another person I want to ask about is future President Donald Trump. This is a key time for him. He kind of, went bankrupt. A number of his ventures fail. How did he use? You mentioned the racial tensions. How did he use the racial tensions to figure out a way back?
Really, this book is among many other things, it's like it is kind of the origin story of Donald Trump, right? This is people I think misunderstand where Trump came from. They think of The Apprentice as being the kind of the birth of Donald Trump, but really, I don't argue this explicitly, but the story I tell in this book, I think pretty clearly reveals that this is 1980s New York is where Donald Trump's crucible. This is the well that he sprang from, and that is the case because he was this is where he learned that that the power that could be gleaned from capturing the public's attention and holding it. That is what he did in these years, largely through the city's tabloids, whether it was through the gossip columns or through his exploits, with Trump Tower, with rebuilding Woolman Rink in Central Park, the famous skating rink that he basically publicly humiliated Ed Koch, forced Koch to kind of give him the right to rebuild the skating rink, and then turn it into an endless kind of PR spectacle. So this is where kind of Trump learned those skills. I kind of tell that story, but to answer your question on the racial side, where Trump really kind of inserts himself into the racial politics in the city is after the Central Park Five, which was, just to remind your listeners, a young woman who's out jogging in Central Park is her body is discovered. She's been raped repeatedly, beaten unconscious, and the police, go out, round up suspects from the park, that immediately. Within 24 hours, these suspects are being charged. They're five black teenagers, who become known as the Central Park Five, and the story is all over the tabloids. And the city is calling for blood immediately. I mean, before there's been before any evidence has been presented, long before the case has gone to trial, everyone has determined that these boys are guilty. Um, Donald Trump sort of sees this moment. He's already kind of at war with Ed Koch, and he's also very much aware of this kind of, this angry kind of white backlash that's building in New York. And he decides that he's going to take out a full page ad in all of the city's papers calling for the execution of these five boys who have not yet faced trial. He's calling for their execution. And he's also kind of condemning Koch's leadership of the city, saying that, you've failed to keep people safe, you failed to keep the city safe. So you see him there really kind of developing the playbook that he would use later as a political candidate. This idea of kind of tapping into, serving as kind of a kind of the angry white id, really, kind of tapping into this anger, this rage, this frustration, whipping up this idea that the city isn't safe, and and this call for vengeance. I mean, that's, we've seen that, we saw that playing out now in
Sounds
Washington
familiar.
D.C.,
Sounds
right?
familiar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask also about the AIDS epidemic. So I would have been 5 in 1988, which means that I lived through elementary school right as the epidemic was. They were kind of getting a handle on it by the early 90s, and you couldn't go a couple of days in elementary school without hearing something else about AIDS and safe sex and all these things. And I mean, they were talking to us about this very young. It was hammered in from my recollection. By the time I was 9 or 10 years old, we all knew about it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember there'd be someone would get cut like in a public place and everyone would run for their gloves. And it was a
Yeah.
real ordeal that, even young kids were exposed to because there was such fear about it.
Yeah.
How did that strain kind of wind its way through the racial tension, the economic difficulties,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
major high profile incidents that color the other aspects of your book?
Yeah, in a variety of ways. So I mean, there was a real hysteria about it, and as you know there that you experienced yourself, and you see in the city. I mean, there were there was a school there was a school in Queens that where there were basically massive protests and boycotts of schools, where children who were HIV positive would be attending, right? Just the very fact that there was an HIV positive kid who'd been born to a mother with AIDS was attending the school, was parents refused to send their kids there. So there was a real hysteria, and what was kind of interesting, or about the whole phenomenon, of course, is that this is an epidemic that begins in the gay population, and you have to remember that this was a time where we were, as a kind of culture, far less tolerant of homosexuality, of like the gay population, the gay community. So there was that, but then AIDS really moves from the gay population largely into the black and sort of homeless and poor population in New York through intravenous drug use. So we're talking about an epidemic that really disproportionately affected already kind of marginalized populations in the city. And you had a city that had really disinvested in its healthcare system because the city had basically gone bankrupt in the 70s. They had closed hospitals, defunded all sorts of medical programs, gotten rid of hospital beds. So you had a city that was just not prepared for a major health epidemic to begin with. So, you had, in the end, just a great deal of frustration coming from these communities, feeling like, that the city is not taking this epidemic seriously enough because of who we are, and that really played into all of the kind of tensions that were roiling the city during these years.
How did all of this foreshadow the Giuliani 90s and the coming backlash that we see today?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so this is very much, you know, what Giuliani, who, runs unsuccessfully for mayor in 89, then runs successfully 4 years later in 93 and then, is elected and goes on to become America's mayor after 9/11. He also kind of used the sort of this was an era of rising crime and rising tension. And so he really invents himself as the kind of law and order figure, the law and order candidate. And even when he's running for mayor in 1993, the city's crime rates are falling. They've, crack is disappearing finally. And after 1990, the city's crime rates are going down. But Rudy sort of sees this as a way to kind of galvanize support again, similar to what we see Trump doing now. That the streets are not safe. New York is not safe, and I am the guy who can fix that for you. And that is what kind of propels Rudy's rise.
The end of your book kind of made me sad. I went over to it and I just took a look at it. Um, the great working class city was gone, you write, and so was any realistic expectation that it might ever be bound by a single civic culture. A new city, or rather an infinite number of cities, had been born. Rich, very poor, for better and for worse, everyone would now live in their own New York. Was that sad for you to write? It was sad for me to read it.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, I, I think, you know, look, the cities, I mean, cities change, cities evolve, and New York in particular, I think, is a city that you know, it's incredible when you think of how much the city has changed over the course of the last, century, say. They are living organisms that are constantly having to adapt to sort of changing circumstances, changing populations, new immigrant populations, kind of new economic conditions. And so, that was to me, these years really marked the end of a long chapter in the life of the city when New Yorkers felt invested in their city in a kind of unified way, even as they were fighting about the future of the city and the city's failures and limitations, there was still a sense that New York was a single city. And I think that the kind of the sort of the great kind of influx of money during these years would just kind of change the city, and that would get changed even further by the changes in the media, right? And how the kind of disappearance of these tabloids, which, as I said earlier, were this kind of unifying force in the city. So, none of this is to say that the city won't change yet again. And I think, you know, you can even see in this ongoing mayoral election that we're now in the midst of, and the rise of Zoran Mamdani, this, a new sense that he's built a pretty big base here of enthusiastic supporters. Whatever you think of him, you can see maybe the beginnings of a new city. I mean, far too early to say, but there's like certainly a new sense of kind of unity around him at least. And so I mean, I think that, for my purposes, that was going to be the story of New York for the decades that followed, and it was kind of, in a way, a sad one. Even though the city in those years, from a different perspective, has created more millionaires and billionaires than any city in the world. I
Yeah,
mean,
there was a number. I forget the stat that was in your book, but I saw the number. I was like, "Whoa, that's a lot." What
yeah,
lessons? What lessons are in this book for the leaders, not just of New York, but for the leaders of every city out there who's battling their own issues with economy, racial strife,
yeah.
uh, difficulty around homelessness?
Yeah. I mean, to me, like they're sort of they're just the impossible logistical challenges of running a city like this, and New York kind of famously is the ungovernable city. Uh, but I also think that there's another kind of lesson here, which is just that what that Koch had been an incredibly successful mayor for his first two terms, and then everything really unravels in this third term. And I think that what you see is that the city kind of loses a certain faith in him, and that is the faith that they lose is the faith in his commitment to the city. And I think, what's most important for a leader of a city is to communicate that enthusiasm, that concern, that sense of, look, I am, I can't solve all your problems, but I'm gonna listen to you, and I'm gonna do my best. I'm gonna try, and so, you know, there's a sense of a kind of empathy, and concern and commitment and kind of love and passion for the place that I think that, the Koch, you see kind of in a way kind of leaching out of Koch during these years as he becomes more and more fixated on his own kind of political fortune and his like sinking popularity.
Just lastly here, why can't New York ever seem to find a mayor that everybody likes, or at least that most people likes? You said ungovernable. What makes it such a difficult city? Why can't we ever find a mayor that we go, that guy's good?
I mean, I think it's just that it's one of the things that makes New York such a special place is that it's just such a collision of ethnicities, of classes, of cultures. And so, I mean, right now you have this young socialist who's lighting up corners of the city, and in other corners of the city are threatening to leave if he gets elected. So, it's you have the richest people in the world living literally blocks away from some of the poorest people, at least in the country. And that is going to like create governing challenges, particularly because the city has these kind of aspirations. New York wants to be New York's brand is possibility. The whole idea behind New York is that we come here, we will lift you up, and you will find opportunity here, and you will make a better life for your children and for yourself.
Yeah, you get on the subway in some poor neighborhood in the Bronx or Brooklyn, and you're at the Empire State Building in 25 minutes.
Exactly. And so, that is to sort of preserve that sense is a real challenge. I mean, and I think it's a high wire act, and I think very few mayors are able to pull it off.
Is there another decade that deserves the Jonathan Mahler treatment?
Probably, but I haven't figured out yet which one yet.
Have
Yeah.
you, is there going to be, I mean, I don't want to get too ahead here, but is this one going to be optioned? Your previous book
Yeah.
became a screen adaptation.
Yeah, this is already being developed to be a scripted TV series at FX. So
Oh, that's exciting. Congratulations. Finally, I want to ask, your favorite New Yorkers are Nora, Gus, and Danielle.
yeah.
Who are they, and why did you dedicate the book to them?
Well, that's my wife and my two kids.
I
So
figured.
yeah, and it's cool. I was born in New York, and then my family moved to California for a number of years, and then they came back when I was in high school. But my kids, they really grew up in the city. They lived, they grew up in Brooklyn, and they know the city so well. They know the subway so well. It's been sort of cool to see.
I
Yeah.
love it. I love it. Jonathan Mahler, the author of The Gods of New York, Egotists, Idealists, Opportunists, and the Birth of the Modern City, 1986 to 1990. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
AxelBankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. Check her work out. It has our most recent episodes on it, featured episodes, and a link to our Patreon page. Go to that Patreon page, patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions, as always, to a charity for children's literacy. Thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.